understand how the Federal Reserve, now that we understand how the banking system works, we want to understand the why of the Federal Reserve, not who they are and what they do, but why did they come into creation. So the Federal Reserve is a banking cartel, and a cartel is nothing more than an enterprise of individuals who come together to snuff out competition, right? That's what the Mexican cartel is. They're snuffing out the American competition or any other cartel. They wanted to make it difficult for new competitors to enter the market. When we ask, how come we don't have more black banks? How come our black banks don't have the capital that Chase Bank has? All of these questions that we ask as a community, this is the answer. The Federal Reserve is one of the major reasons as to why new competitors have trouble entering the market or don't last in the market once they enter. They also wanted to utilize the police power of the United States government to enforce whatever agreements they came to. Have you guys ever heard the saying, don't fight the Fed?
Yep.
They say it all the time.
Okay.
Don't fight the Fed. Okay. And it's really the federal government that conditioned you to have the idea like, don't fight them. So the Federal Reserve was formed. What was happening in this time that the banking cartels decided to get together and form what's called a Federal Reserve? Well, in 1910, they noticed that there was a phenomenal amount of banks springing up. They doubled over 20,000. And the majority of these banks were prosperous and springing up in the South and some in the West, causing New York banks to suffer a steady decline of market share. This is a quote that comes from The Creature of Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffith, great book. We'll get more of this book as we continue these master classes. But it didn't happen in 1910. They were just noticing it then. They've been watching it for a while. Between 1880 and 1910, the majority of the banks that were springing up in the South and in the West were non-federal banks. And that was the problem. So to understand what they were looking at, you had to know what it meant when we say non-federal banks. After the Civil War, with the protection of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, African Americans enjoyed a period where they could vote, they could participate in the political process, they could acquire the land of former owners, slave owners, and they can seek their own employment. This is the post-Reconstruction era. This is when slaves, who were the skilled laborers of the United States, now had to work for themselves, work for each other, work for previous slave owners. So guess what? These are Black people. Did they live in white society? Nope. They had to create their own communities. So the skilled labor, your productive class, your productive working class, now has established communities where they needed banks. Would the white people allow them to be a federal bank? Nope. Also, what happened in those communities that doesn't happen now is the money velocity. When you live, let's just say you lived in a town in Kansas. I'm gonna make that up, right? Let's call it Kachuki Town, right? When the community of Kachuki Town is taking care of their transactions, buying and selling from one another, that money is circulating hundreds, if not thousands of times within that community. They had money in their accounts at that time, and they typically weren't using other banks. So you didn't have the problem where I wrote a check for my bank, but I wrote a check to you, but your bank was somewhere else and the money was leaving this bank to go to that bank. No, these communities were especially prosperous because of the money velocity. Now, the book that I got this information from, he's a white man. He's not talking to us. And this is one of the things that Cash and I want to really drive home to you. Wealthy people talk to each other. They don't talk to us. And it's important that we do our due diligence and we sit in on the conversations and we put those conversations into context for us. So what was really happening is these non-federal banks are now springing up. They're very prosperous. Money was backed by gold then. So their purchasing power is either increasing or at least they're maintaining it, and they're making significant profits. They're thriving. Hi, Brian. I saw you just joined the room. I tried to take this picture for you guys, but taking a picture of something that's already scanned is absolutely horrible. But I wanted to show you this is actually a ledger from the Hampton Plantation. And they're showing you here that the slaves that used to work on the plantation were now actually making money. So this is in 1866. I can only take a small part of the ledger, but the ledger goes from 1866 to 1890. And some of these slaves were making $25, $37. I saw one slave made $92. And you have to imagine that that is a significant amount of money in those days, all backed by gold. So, how the economy worked from 1880 to 1912, prosperity equaled competition for the banks. The banks do not want to see these communities thriving. Part of the reason why is because they're non-federal banks. They're not able to get a cut of any of that money from those banks. Problem. Two, they're Black people. We had no idea that when we freed you, we kind of thought you guys were just going to die off. No idea you were going to thrive and do better than you've ever done. Okay? So remember, the entire point of the banking cartel coming together as the Federal Reserve was to minimize competition. They needed to make it difficult for these new banks to enter the market, to thrive in the market, and to grow. Here's another fact that's very important. 70% of the funding for the American corporation's growth was generated internally. It means that when these businesses are drawing profits, they are now taking their own profits in order to scale up, to branch out, to create more business. And again, if the bank's not loaning you the money, that's a problem, isn't it? Okay? And it was making all of these Black industries increasingly independent of the bank. So you're not getting the loans, you're not able to get any interest from them. These aren't even your banks. You don't have any control of the money in the vault. You don't have control of the accounts. This was a very significant problem for these like 12 white men. Another reason prosperity was a threat, we talked about it, money's backed by gold 1-to-1. I want you guys to take a good look at the pictures that I did use, right? This is what your banking, this is what your reserve note looked like back then. This is before the reserve, but you get where I'm going, right? They tell you that this is payable in gold. Notice it says gold coin. The slide before that tells you that it's redeemable for gold. Okay, this was your actual claim check. You can walk into a bank and trade it in for the actual gold piece. So the Federal Reserve, these men, they're from all over the world, by the way. Paul Warburg, I always say his name wrong. He's actually from Europe, and he's always been a huge advocate of making the money supply more elastic, meaning they want to be able to control the money supply according to what they think it should be as far as commerce goes. So he came from Central Europe. The Rothschilds are from Europe. JP Morgan is a New Yorker. I have a group there. I have it in a few other slides. Kuhn Loeb, I think he's German. But this banking cartel now comes together. They meet on this island in secrecy in Georgia, okay? And they came up with this plan. Plan one. What they needed to do was to tip the balance of interest rates downward so that the economy can favor debt, because right now the economy is favoring prosperity. That's a problem. They also wanted to disconnect the money supply from gold, right? You can't redeem it for this anymore. We just want to make it a paper. That way we can increase the money supply whenever we feel like it. They wanted to create, this was the most integral part of their system. They want to create a system, this way they can shift blame away from themselves. So a little bit of backstory. During this time, from 1880 to 1912, there were over 1,700 banks that failed. They completely failed. And the main reason it was 1,748 banks failed was because the banks were practicing what's calling loan up. So this is even worse than fractional reserve lending. They were lending out more money than they even had by kind of, if Percy brings his paycheck every week, And keep in mind, there was no automatic payments back then. If Percy brings his paycheck every week, what they were doing was forecasting that he's going to continue to bring a paycheck every week, and we're going to lend out that money that he hasn't even brought yet. And when sharecroppers or other people, things happened and that autonomy just didn't happen for whatever reason, maybe they lost their sharecropping job or so on and so forth, they're lending out money that didn't even come to them yet. And the bank systems were failing when people were going in and demanding the money. The money being backed by gold is limited in supply. So it was a lot easier for the banks to fail than utilizing that Ponzi scheme. The second thing that went wrong was in white communities, if Percy worked for me, but he lived in a different town, when I gave Percy his pay and he goes to the town that he lives, my bank has to physically take that money to his bank in the town that he lives in. So that money is leaving that economy and moving into a different one. If they do that too much, if the work, if the transactions are happening that way, that's called a currency drain. And this is the reason why those banks were failing. Of course, they were federal banks because that was white society. Black society couldn't do that, and it worked in their favor. They wanted to create a system where when the banking system fails, they can shift blame away from them and kind of hide it as part of the national economic problem. Okay?